Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm David Glasgow. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the final event of this remarkable exhibition, which is rightly going to be in the hands of our curator, Sarah MacDougall. We've had really an amazing series. It started off by David Herman, then Sir Jeremy Isaacs, and now, last but certainly not least, Sarah, who is going to take us around the exhibition. Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the exhibition. For those of you who haven't been already, I just want to give you the exhibition title because that explains the layout of the show, what we're trying to do, and I'll just give you a little bit of background as to why we're doing it now as well, and then I'll take you on a tour through the works up here and downstairs. So the exhibition title is Josef Herman, Warsaw, Brussels, Glasgow, London, 1938 to 44. And it covers 6 tumultuous years in Herman's life when he was forced to flee through these European cities for this period of 6 years. And this was at the very start of his artistic career. So at this period, his work was the most experimental that it would ever be. It was incredibly colourful, as you see from the walls around you, particularly up here. And it shows often influences which would later disappear, as well as dealing predominantly with Jewish subject matter. And this is also something which would disappear entirely from his work after the war. So really what we're hoping to do here is show you the Josef Herman you don't know. This takes us right up to the period where he went to Wales, to Astraganlais in South Wales, where he began to paint the miners in 1944. And of course, this is the work for which he's rightly acclaimed and best known. So we look at what happened before that, the sort of artist he was, and how his work was forming so that it would come to fruition when he reached Wales in 1944. So you won't see a miner here tonight, but you will see lots of colour and lots of experimentation. So we start here with 2 very modest works. It's a very quiet exhibition, sorry, very quiet opening to an exhibition. And I just wanted to explain why we chose these works to open the exhibition. I will give you a bit of background about Herman, but just to say the top work is dated between 1938 and 40, and it's called Leaving Home. And it commemorates the moment that Herman left his home in Warsaw. He was seen off at the station by his parents. There was a tearful farewell, as you can see, and he never saw them again. So, how did he get to this point? Well, he was born in 1911 in Warsaw, in a mainly working-class Jewish district of Warsaw, and he was brought up there among mainly artisan community, of which his father was part. The work we see underneath is a cobbler's shop. You see the boots hanging in the window to denote the trade. And his father was, in fact, a very disappointed man. He had had a small shoe factory with a partner, and he was swindled out of this business because he was illiterate and mistakenly signed some papers giving over his share. So he returned to his business of being a cobbler. He's commemorated in the portrait at the end of the room, which I will speak about shortly. And as I said, he was a disappointed man. So Joseph grew up with this background. His mother was the centre, of course, of home life, and Joseph was very close to her. And he, after leaving school, he did a series of menial jobs before finding work as a typesetter. That was his first profession. And as a typesetter, he was actually introduced to a lot of visual art. He looked through a lot of magazines. He was encouraged to do so, to look for reproductions of art and so on while he was there. So all the time, although he was working in a different profession, his visual imagination was being awakened. He also remembered, particularly in his memoirs, an incident as a child when he was sent by the local sign writer out to buy £1/2 of ultramarine, the very blue pigment for the sign writer to paint with. And he remembered this particularly as an overwhelming incident in his young years. It introduced him to colour, to pigment, and to the possibilities of paint. And that stayed with him. And you'll see when we get to the works from Glasgow that this colour, ultramarine and other shades of blue, was to become a very dominant colour in his palette during that period, and specifically used to reference his work of the Warsaw period. So from this job as a typesetter, which he enjoyed very much, this career came to an abrupt end when, due to a prank in which lead type was put into a sandwich, he got severe lead poisoning, couldn't continue with that career. And that enabled him to take some evening classes in art while modelling for the local director of the local art school. And that continued just for a short while until Herman discovered that the director was in fact anti-Semitic, and he left there and was very briefly trained at the Warsaw School of Art between about 1930 and 31. But he said, in fact, that he learnt nothing there. He learnt far more from Warsaw itself. It was, of course, highly politicised in the 1930s. And Herman instinctively became very left-wing. He was very interested in portraying working people, both peasants in the rural countryside and the working people amongst whom he'd grown up. And in this guise, he became part of a group called the Phrygian Bonnet, a wonderful translation of the term from the Polish, and that refers to a red cap, a conical cap worn by the French revolutionaries, mainly that's what we recall it for, and underlining the freedom and political commitment of the artists in the group. They were united more by their political beliefs than by any artistic style. Nevertheless, they had two exhibitions in 1936 and 37 before the build-up to the Second World War and rising anti-Semitism brought those activities to an end. But this was a very important grouping for Herman, and we know from recollections of this period that he was doing work in this time of peasants, of artisans, that he was particularly interested in artists like Van Gogh, and in a moment we'll see how that fed directly into his work. So in 1938 he found himself often not sleeping in the same place. He said he went to prison once or twice, he lost a tooth or two. It was a hard place to be Jewish, to be an artist, and to be left-wing. And in 1938, he obtained a false passport and he left Warsaw and went to Brussels. And this is where we came in with the portrait Leaving Home, which we see his mother saying goodbye to Herman, his father and grandfather behind. Just an interesting note on this picture is that during his lifetime, it was always given the date of around 1938, and it was believed by Herman's widow, Nini, his second wife, that the work had been brought to England sometime by someone coming out of Poland. However, it could also very easily be from the Glasgow period, from 1940. You can see there's an extensive use of wash there, which you'll also see in some of the works downstairs. And Herman did record in his memoirs that he was using that wash for the first time in the Glasgow period. So it seems much more likely that it is actually a retrospective work done in about 1940, but obviously referencing this key moment. So the reason I have those two works there is because we have nothing from the Warsaw period. Everything that Herman did in that period is believed to have been destroyed. We hope very much that somebody will emerge with something that survived from that period, but as far as we know, and extensive research has been done by Professor Jerzy Malinowski in Poland, everything he did, as I say, from that period was destroyed. So moving on from there, Herman went to Brussels. We may wonder why he went to Brussels rather than Paris, traditionally the artistic capital to which all young aspiring artists would take themselves. But Herman repudiated the influence of French painting very much in this period, and he was very drawn to the northern masters, particularly Rembrandt, Bruegel and Van Gogh, who I've mentioned. And you can see in both these two, again, modest drawings here, that was very much an influence in the period. This one on top, the pen and ink, a peasant drives his cart across the landscape with the setting sun behind. Very much the sort of thing we find in early Van Gogh drawings. And Herman actually brought this work out of Brussels himself when he was forced to flee a little later, and he took it to Scotland and he gave it to the wife of Ben O'Shots in return for hospitality. Sorry, the sister of Ben O'Shots, in return for hospitality that he received from her. And the work beneath, also a modest drawing, and I think that indicates why it survived, in that one could take these kind of works out, they were portable, but perhaps with the bigger works this was much harder. And this was given to a friend of Herman's who was also able to get it out of Brussels. And again, we see an unpeopled landscape this time, but the sort of humble dwelling in which peasants or artisans would have lived, and so again very much in keeping with Herman's sympathies at the time. Next to that we have two paintings, each very different from each other, and I should say that these four works, as far as we know, are the only surviving works from the Brussels period. Again, probably because he would flee Brussels as he'd fled Warsaw, and as I've already said, it was obviously very difficult to take work with him. So this is a very extraordinary portrait, and really, if one were to see it completely out of context, probably you wouldn't think of Herman as the artist. For a start, it's very tactile surface. You can see the paint is worked here, the subject itself, it's called Woman in Yellow Turban, but when we look closely we can see the turban is actually a headdress of bananas, that she's surrounded by fruit. We have cherries, we have apples, we have pears. She is in fact a modern cornucopia. There's nothing quite like this in the rest of Herman's work. We have one study downstairs in which we have a slightly similar female figure, but perhaps she was a figure entirely out of his imagination. We just don't know. Next to that we have a very different work, and this is very delightful because Herman's actually signed for us Brussels Herman on the bottom right. We also have an inscription here in Yiddish, which I'll come to in a moment. The work is called The Gamblers, and again it's something you might expect to see in a French work such as Cézanne. Composition reminds us very much of the card players, but the treatment, as you can see, is very different, and he's likely to have been more inspired by Dutch genre scenes that he saw in Brussels. We know from his memoirs that he literally haunted the museums there from the moment he arrived, ready to go in the moment they opened and spending days going through the museums. And the treatment of the figures, I think, slightly angular, again a colourful palette, slightly expressionist, but almost a vorticist feel to them. So again, not quite like anything else in Herman's oeuvre. So I've said he went to Brussels in 1938. He spent about a year and a half there, and he was forced to leave in 1940 when the Germans invaded. He then found himself on the road to France with about 2 million others, and he made his way to the port of La Rochelle. At the port, he was manhandled onto a boat by military policemen who mistook him for a Polish deserter because he was wearing a long black leather overcoat and a black beret, and this was traditionally considered to be the uniform of the Polish airmen. Once on the boat, it was bound for Canada, but it was diverted by the threat of submarines to Liverpool. And when he got to Liverpool, he was told to present himself to the Polish consul. They were in Biggar in Lanarkshire, just outside Glasgow, and so he arrived in Glasgow with no control over where he went, not speaking the language and knowing no one. So the first thing that he did was go to Glasgow Library, And there he was given a scribbled introduction to the sculptor Benno Schatz. You can see Benno Schatz's work just here, the two figures in the case. It's from about a decade later, and it's called The Mourners, then I think clearly referencing this difficult period in history. So Schatz was an Estonian-born sculptor, but had been in Glasgow for many years by this time, and was head of sculpture and ceramics at the Glasgow School of Art. And he also introduced Herman, or reintroduced him, I should say, to a fellow Polish painter, Jankel Adler, who was living down the road. Adler had joined the Free Polish Army when he was in France and been discharged, and the two men were delighted to be reunited in Glasgow. The three of them spoke Yiddish together, and this was a conduit for Herman to his roots, made him feel immediately at home and helped him with the barrier of language, although he seemed to be a gifted linguist in that he soon mastered the language, and that was one of, I think, half a dozen that he eventually spoke. So Schatz introduced Herman and Adler to the Glasgow art scene, and astonishingly it was very vibrant during this period. Despite being wartime, we have here a work by J.D. Ferguson, the Scottish colourist, Bridge over the River Kelvin, and Ferguson had himself returned to Glasgow in this period and was to start the New Art Club in 1940 in December, of which Herman and Adler were to be prominent members, even though they were only really there in Glasgow for about 2.5 years. They made a considerable contribution while they were there. The picture in the middle, the portrait, is of Millie Schatz, who was Benno's wife, and Herman painted this again in return for the hospitality he received from Schatz. Millie didn't like it very much. I think you can see why. She appears rather stern. I think he's capturing her rather sculptural features, but there are some delightful details in it. The period hairstyle, which has been traced out with the end of the brush. And you see this very blue background, which I mentioned earlier. You'll see in the other portraits which distinctly reference Warsaw, it's a much richer blue, but this is the beginning of the use of that colour, and also the little motif of the full moon on the top left. Next to that, we have a portrait of Jack Goldman. Goldman was one of a number of Jewish businessmen who supported Herman and Adler during their time in Glasgow. Of course, they were almost penniless when they arrived and had to start re-establishing their careers from scratch, which they did do very successfully, but they were certainly supported by this group of businessmen who either commissioned portraits like this one, bought works such as My Family and I, which I'll show you in a moment down that part of the gallery, and the inscription on the gamblers here in Yiddish that I mentioned earlier, that is again to another of the businessmen who had helped him. And just to say, it's extraordinary to think that these two portraits, the portrait of Millie and the portrait of Goldman, are painted in the same year. They're only months apart, and yet the technique is so completely different. We see this very expressionist work on the far right, and then, you know, really moving into a slightly different style with the portrait of Millie. So I just want to now draw your attention to this set of portraits here in the inset. These are from a time when Herman, having presented himself to the Polish consul, was seconded into the Polish army for a short time. He experienced some sort of anti-Semitism there, and he requested a transfer to the British army. The transfer, in fact, never came, and he was eventually discharged. The details are a little obscure, but certainly he found himself for some weeks in a refugee camp for Polish refugees in South Norwood in London. And out of that time, these wonderful, really vibrant heads emerged. The only one where we know the sitter is this one on the top left. The sitter is the poet Itzik Manger, who Herman had known again already in Warsaw and would be reunited again with in London. Again, another conduit to his Warsaw roots, another Yiddish speaker. In fact, he wrote his poetry in Yiddish, and again, that's a side of Herman's culture which he was able to keep up with through his friendships. He left a wonderful description of Manger in his memoirs, which exactly conforms to this portrait. He said that he was so thin that no collar could be found that would fit his neck. His eyelids were rather red, his face was rather green, and his hair was rather wild. And so whether the description or the portrait came first, we don't know. How these works came about was that the camp was visited by the Red Cross, who came really to give the men suits of clothes or write letters home, that sort of thing. Instead of a suit of clothes, although he was in rags, he said, Herman requested some tubes of paint and some paper. And when a little parcel arrived with these tubes of gouache inside, it brought tears to his eyes. He also received just 2 brushes, one large and one small. And when the portrait of Manger came in, we were astonished to see that on the back he had painted the message, "Painted with hair." Artist internees in this period were often really resourceful with materials. Artists on the Isle of Man, for example, made their own paints from vegetable dyes and ink from margarine and so on. And also, like Herman, they often supplemented their brushes with hair either from their head or their beard. So it's astonishing to think that, you know, work as good and as vibrant as this could have been executed with the poor quality of materials that he had. And we know that he arranged to carry out some sort of little misdemeanor, which meant that he was put in solitary confinement, i.e. he got a room to himself, which he could use as a studio. And I think we can certainly say that the 3 portraits with the blue background, again you'll note the rising moon, and the rather thin face certainly of this subject, are probably again done certainly in the camp and probably a fellow Polish refugees. The other portraits are slightly different in feeling, and although I said that Herman repudiated French influence, certainly these 2, I think, feel quite fauve in manner, almost Matissean, this one. And that was perhaps due to the influence of Ferguson. Perhaps he completed them after he left the camp, and again was experimenting with colour. Then, in 1941, after he'd been discharged, Herman did a project in Glasgow with the Glasgow Unity Theatre, and that's the work we see on this long wall here. This is a portfolio of costumes and decor for a project called We Are This Land, which was to be a history of Russia, a very partial history of Russia, we might say. The Glasgow Unity Theatre was an amalgam of small theatre groups with a commitment to encouraging working class audiences and was staunchly socialist in its outlook. So again, this fitted very well with Herman's own principles. And the work that he designed also reflects these. So to start with, we have a stage set with the Russian eagle on the curtain at the back. And I should say that this is the first time these have ever been framed up. They had been shown once before, but in the portfolio. And when they came out of the portfolio, they still smelt incredibly strongly of paint, and they look really so fresh as if they were just painted yesterday. But Herman's history consisted of a series of villains and heroes. We start with the villains. So at the top, we have the Eastern capitalist in yellow with the sun. Below him, we have the Western capitalist, a fat man with a pound sign on his pocket. The hero is above, the communist with the communist star, and below, of course, the Nazi. And then another set of heroes, the working people. This was to be one of the dominant themes of Herman's work throughout his life, as I've already said. And although his style would change, this message of the empathy and dignity of working people was present right throughout his career. So we have the workman on the top, the peasant beneath, the two peasant women, and then two more villains on the end, the Spanish Republican soldier and a rather frightening Russian transit officer, again with the eagle on his belt. This was a successful performance. It was performed twice at least, and from that Herman moved on the following year to do a project in which he worked with the Celtic Ballet Club, which was set up by Margaret Morris, who was the founder of the eponymous dance schools and the wife, of course, of J.D. Ferguson, the Scottish colourist. So she set up the Celtic Ballet Club, and Herman created this extraordinary project in which he conceived the actual ballet, the decor, the costumes and the set design for this work, which he called the Ballet of the Palette. And he said it was to be a semi-surrealistic fantasy which would last about half an hour. And if we just look at this stage set here, we can see the stage itself is a palette. On the back we have the colours waiting to be mixed. They are to be mixed by a large brush and a small brush, which you'll remember from his time in camp. And these are a couple of the colours, the pink and the blue. The other thing to note, of course, was that he said as the curtain rose, you would see as a backdrop a blue canvas with a rising moon. Again, this evocation of Warsaw. And right at the end of the ballet, after the colours had been mixed, Herman said he wanted them all to return to the stage, but this time they were to be individuals, and they were all to appear in costumes and masks. And here we have 5 photographs, which are facsimiles of photos taken from the performance in 1942. There were actually about a dozen performances of this ballet, so it was quite successful. And as I say, Herman did everything except write the music. And what's particularly interesting about these wonderful costumes is you see how the hats are peaked and the faces are masked. And they seem to relate very strongly to this work here, which I hadn't discussed yet, which is a picture of Purim. When we go downstairs, we'll see many more pictures depicting the festival of Purim, which I'm delighted to say is today. And again, you nearly always find the figure of Hammond represented by the pointed hat, figures who are masked, often a musician dancing, and variations on this. And it seems particularly apt that Herman should choose this as a symbol of the saving of the Jewish people at a time when Jewish culture and indeed life throughout Europe was under threat during the Second World War. So I just want to finish up here with these 2 works at the end. This is a particularly interesting work. It was painted in 1941 and it's called My Family and I. And in it, Herman has depicted the whole of his family back in Warsaw in one room of their tenement. They in fact lived in only 2 rooms of the tenement, so it's not very far from the truth. And in this period, Herman had not heard about his family, so he was concerned about them, but they had yet to suffer their eventual fate. So it's a nostalgic look back just during a time in which he's missing them. On the top left, we have the girl at the window with the cat. This is his sister Zelda, who was deaf and dumb. His father, the cobbler, on the bottom left of the picture, again depicted over here. In the centre, at the literal and symbolic heart of a household, is his mother, Sarah. She did indeed take in washing, and here she is doing the washing at the centre. Next to her is his brother Shmuel over his books. He's known to have been very studious. His maternal grandfather at prayer here on the right. And again, this is a study of him which we were delighted to find more or less as we opened the exhibition, featuring in the same work. At the back, the little hump in the bedclothes is the Baba or grandmother. And then right down at the foreground of the picture, we have Joseph himself in a self-portrait. And by now you will not be surprised to see that the picture on the easel features the famous blue with the moon, And again, we have a Purim figure, this time playing the violin. So it's very much a set of works from this period which ties up in theme and motif in a very deliberate way. Just one final thing to mention. In the background we have a little picture of Goya, a self-portrait from the Capriccios. This is a reproduction of it here. We know that Herman's most important work in Warsaw was created around this work. Unfortunately, it was destroyed. And again, when he was asked why he included it in the picture, he said because he couldn't have Lenin. So another indication, should it be needed, of his principles. And then finally up here we have this beautiful portrait from 1943, sorry Aggie, of his father. By this time he knew that his family had all been killed, so it's a retrospective portrait sort of warmed by nostalgia and by a knowledge of the fate of his family. This work is interesting in a number of ways. It's probably the only work that we know surviving which shows the influence of the Flemish expressionists. When he was in Brussels, he mixed particularly with Constant Permica, whose work he admired and whom he later wrote about. And the sort of earthy tones and the real grounding of the figure are very much something that would be found in Permica's work. And it also, I think, looks forward to the kind of work that we do recognise as Herman's later on from Astraganlis and beyond, when he very much created monumental, strong, static figures, usually at work, usually miners or other artisans. So it's just a glimpse of the work that's to come. And if you'd like to come downstairs, we'll just have a quick look at the rest of the show. In this room and the next, we have predominantly work from a series called The Memory of Memories, which was a title Herman gave to the works much later. Most of them were created between 1940 and 43, but it's often not possible to say exactly in which year they were painted or drawn. The works we'll see in the next room relate more specifically to 1942 to 3, and I'll explain why that is when we go through. What Herman was doing in this series of works was nostalgically evoking his lost Warsaw, which was left behind, which he knew or suspected he could never recover. And he did this with really quick, fluid sketches in pencil or ink, sometimes a little splash of watercolour. And these are very much memories of the kind of thing he left behind. So we have at the top the artist's grandmother with a candle, probably on a Friday night, her head is covered. Beneath, just a very beautiful drawing of a woman with a cup. The very fragility of these two works in particular, I think, shows something about the kind of journey they've come through, much like Herman's journey himself. And really all the works along this side are interior scenes. We have a boy doing his homework at the table, the mother preparing food. We have two tailors ogling a young girl instead of getting on with their work. We have people gossiping over here. A cat, which often appears, is in the scene behind. And there are many scenes with the rabbi, the symbolic head of the community, of course, often with a young pupil, sometimes studying, sometimes obviously his attention is wandering, and the ubiquitous cockerel is also often present. From these we move to exterior scenes, and we see things like people at work, Jewish peasant milking a goat. This one is called Jewish Peasant Speaking. He's obviously shouting, so I think there's a little joke in there. Village scenes, the beggar, and a whole run of works of musicians. In these works in particular, Herman's work comes closest to that of Chagall. This was an influence, again, he later repudiated. He later destroyed a number of works from this period. And perhaps he came to believe that that was not the most original part of his work. But while it lasted, there's a wonderful mix between these works and the paintings he would do in this period. We have 3 paintings on this wall, all using this nostalgic washy blue from the period. Figures such as to be found in the drawings, like the cockerel in the background. This one has a Hebrew inscription. Many of these drawings, I should say, have Yiddish inscriptions. And so again, very directly tying him back to his roots. The organ grinder, the wonderful painting in the middle, can perhaps almost be seen as a symbolic self-portrait, the wandering musician, like the wandering artist. And then in the last portrait on that wall, the Jewish shepherd, we see the shepherd playing his instrument, and I think it's really rather a goat than a sheep beneath. Nevertheless, it's called the Jewish shepherd. And here Herman is combining the instruments with a pastoral scene, and we have a couple of other evocations of pastoral scenes. There are 2 beautiful drawings on this side, which are specifically called Memories of Warsaw. We see peasants in the field with a hay fork, and beneath them peasants in the field with a scythe. Again, that beautiful use of wash that we noted in the portrait upstairs. And these again have more in common with the kind of work that Herman would go on to do, celebrating working people when he got to Wales. Just a couple of little interesting quirky works, if you like, to point out on this pillar. Here we have a portrait of Helen Biggar. Helen Biggar was a sculptor, later a filmmaker and designer. She was from Glasgow, and she worked with Herman and posed for him during this period. I think that's an astonishingly good portrait, just a tiny little, quickly, fluidly done work. But, you know, the sort of thing which he could dash off very quickly and convincingly. Helen Biggar was also involved, like Herman, with the Glasgow Unity Theatre and the Celtic Ballet Company, doing work for them. Next to Helen, we have a picture of a Glasgow workman. So to show, although he was dealing mostly with Jewish subjects in his work in this period, it was not entirely so. He was still also observing the local workmen in the streets. And next to that, we have a very intriguing picture, which we've just called Figure in a Street. It appears to be a figure who is wounded, perhaps dead, collapsed in the street. Behind him are the tall, balconied kind of buildings you would find in Warsaw, which Herman later remembered in his memoir. Some overturned barricades, perhaps tables, quickly evoked background, perhaps it's rubble, perhaps fallen people. The red has been suggested as being a flag or being blood. So a very intriguing work, certainly I would say referring to the Warsaw period, but it's open to interpretation exactly what Herman meant by it. But I think that's a good introduction to the kind of work we'll find in the middle room here, where after 1942, when Herman receives the news that his entire family had been killed in the Warsaw ghetto, the work darkens considerably, and the work in this room references war, violence, pogroms, and destruction. First of all, I'd like to show you this work on the far wall. This is a work by Jankel Adler, who, you remember I said they worked together in Glasgow, and later Adler would also be in London when Herman came to London in 1943. However, Adler was with Herman during this period when he received this terrible news, and he nursed him through the resulting breakdown, and painted this picture specifically to commemorate the moment. And we see 2 figures very somberly painted, very dark palette. They seem to be trapped behind this bar. You notice that it goes the entire way across the canvas. And they're surrounded by this black border, which seems reminiscent of the borders you would find on mourning stationery. One of them clutches a letter, presumably receiving this terrible news, and it's called Orphans. Adler is also the artist of this wonderful portrait here, Mother and Child from 1941, in which you can see that the embrace of the mother is perhaps just a little too tight. It's a little tense. It suggests some anxiety. This is possibly reworked by Herman in the works you see on the right and left. There are 3 works in all, but the title for them is Memory of a Pogrom. And you see a mother clutching her baby, saving it from the encroaching destruction which seems to overwhelm them. This work is also featured in a little Yiddish magazine of the period called Loschen Leben, which was put together by the poet Avrom Stenzel, who was part of Herman's circle in London. This is from 1943 when he was in London, and this work is shown next to one by Adler, drawing attention to this relationship in which there's a brief correlation between their 2 works. The works on this wall here are a continuation of the Memory of Memories series, but you see that instead of the warm nostalgic evocations of earlier, we have people, horses and riders fleeing in distress. We have a man saving a baby. This man reappears in the work next to it, and there is a Yiddish inscription on this one where you see the fiery background behind it. And when we had this translated, this translates as the Warsaw Ghetto is burning, and it commemorates the moment of the Warsaw Uprising. The figure himself is very interesting. In this magazine here, the Jewish Chronicle, a little later, it reproduced some of Herman's themes and types, as he called them, from Sholem Aleichem, the Yiddish writer, whose stories he knew well and brought with him in his head. In the next room you'll see some of the illustrations he did to Yiddish writers, which he did entirely from his head and from memory, and they include Sholem Aleichem, Stenzel himself, Itzik Manga and other writers. But this includes a portrait of the character Tevye the milkman, later famous, of course, from Fiddler on the Roof, known to be a devoted father. And one of his tropes is this peaked cap worn by the milkman, which is shown in this figure of the father saving a baby, and I think gives it an extra poignancy when you think it's a representative figure such as that. In other works here we see a woman sending her son off to war. In this one, the anguished woman sees people disappearing on a train behind. And the final work at the top is simply called After a Pogrom, which we see an old couple simply enduring. One of the most poignant works, I think, for me is this small one here, Refugees, which, like the 2 beside it, from the Glasgow period, are particularly special because I think he's counterpointing the poverty of his subjects and their lives with the rich use of colour. This one work could really stand for the whole of this period and the many people fleeing because of the war. So we move from this period which really brings to a close the Memory of Memories series, to the rest of the work that Herman did before he came to London. On this wall we have a couple of pictures from the Isle of Skye. I should explain that while he was in Glasgow, Herman had exhibitions with the new art club that we mentioned upstairs and their associated offshoot, the Centre. His Glasgow exhibition with the gallery Aitken Dott and Sons was reprised in Edinburgh, and at that show it was visited by a young lady called Catriona MacLeod, who was the unconventional daughter of a whiskey seller, and a few weeks later they married. And they went off to the Isle of Skye, where she had spent much of her childhood. And we have just sort of representative two works from that period, but I think you can see that already the figures are slightly beginning to change. So instead of these sort of vibrant, quick figures that he was sketching in the Memory of Memories series, we're moving towards more static, monumental representations in the two fishermen there. This landscape here looks very quiet, but it has a number of notes on it that suggest he would have made a beautiful colour scheme. He refers to deep violet, gold, umber and other colours. So as far as we know, it was not translated into a painting. A small series of nudes here just show that apart from the subject matter we've already seen, he was also dealing with the classic subject matter of the artist. These nudes go up to 1944, but they then tail off, as when he got to the small village of Astragamlis, it was much harder to persuade women to come and take their clothes off when they felt they could be recognised by their neighbours. And on this wall we have some of the illustrations to Yiddish writers that I mentioned. So again, Sholem Aleichem, Peretz, Itzik Manger here, and so on. So these, he said, were done entirely from memory. They were almost to comfort him. He didn't have the books with him and he wished to remember the stories. Just tucked in the corner we have a rather charming little self-portrait, obviously done in the mirror. Behind on the wall seems to be one of the figures from one of his Purim pictures, which you will find on this long wall behind you. As I mentioned earlier, he covered the subject of Purim throughout the war years. So the earliest works here begin in 1940, and the last one is from 1945. He never returned to the subject after 1945, and I think there's a direct correlation between what is happening to European Jewry and Herman using this as a symbol, a motif in his work to establish the importance of Jewish culture, Purim being the festival, of course, in which the Jewish people are saved from destruction by the figure of Esther. But the depictions in the Purim works vary considerably. We start with two works from 1940 on the far left, and these sort of flamboyantly costumed and masked figures, despite the presence of the moon that we find in the Warsaw works, are really much less like the other works in the series. They were possibly completed in Brussels. There's known to have been a large fair just outside Brussels. I think it's now a World Heritage Site. And these figures could be at home in, you know, pictures of the Commedia dell'arte. They don't particularly look like Purim figures. After that, however, we move to works which are much more closely tied in with the celebrations around the ceremony, in which people often wear pointed hats to reference the figure of Haman. And as in the final work, with the blue background, you'll see the figure with a graga or rattle, which is rattled every time the name of Haman is mentioned. In between that, we have an ecstatic sect dancing. This was catalogued as a Purim picture during Herman's lifetime, and is just known as Jews dancing. And the little sketch to the left of it replicates the figure that we find dancing on the right. This final work I wanted to just discuss in a little more detail. This is in fact the last work, this one here. This is from 1945, so if you like, that's his last word on Purim. And I personally find that a very dark and menacing picture, which I think sums up the war years. This picture from 1943 feels quite different. Again, we have the masks and the pointy hats that we associate with the figures of Purim, but the masks here are rather extraordinary. This may be because during this period Herman met Joseph Epstein, who of course had famously used a visored masked figure on his rock drill, which he later cut down during the First World War. And also Epstein, of course, famously had his own ethnographic collection. He inspired Herman to begin one of his own. Both had very important collections. And perhaps the masks here relate to the kind of things that Herman was seeing in this collection. Certainly they are nothing like the masks we saw in the figures upstairs or in any of the other works. Again, the palette is quite different. He's still experimenting. But we have some points of continuity with the sketches over there on the left. The figure on the far right is always seen pointing, presumably to the figure of Haman, the villain, with the pointy hat. So during this period, Herman came to London. He came in January 1943 in order to have an exhibition at the Reed and Lefebvre Galleries, a very prestigious gallery in London. And he shared the exhibition with the then little-known L.S. Lowry. While he was preparing for that exhibition, he spent some months in London, and during this period he mixed predominantly with a number of other artists and writers and intellectuals whom he met at the OHEL Centre. The OHEL Centre was specifically for Polish Jewish refugees. It was founded by the brothers Ben Uri and Alexander Margulies in 1942, and it didn't make it to the end of the war, but during its short time it was an extremely important centre for people to mix and swap ideas freely. And some of the most important figures in Herman's life during this short period were the painter Martin Bloch, whose self-portrait we see here. David Bomberg, not a refugee of course, a Londoner. Josef Herman himself in a self-portrait. And on the far right we have Avrom Stenzel, the Yiddish poet, who I mentioned in the other room, had produced the magazine Losch and Leben with an article about Yiddish and Jewish painters in London in this period. Over on the plinth we see a bust of Alexander Margulies from this period, 1942, by Jacob Epstein. Another member of this circle was Ludwig Meidner. This is a self-portrait in a sketchbook from internment. Meidner was interned on the Isle of Man between 1940 and 41, up to 42, I believe. And internment was a very mixed experience for refugees. Some of them felt incredibly depressed. This was something that happened to Bloch, being confined at all after their terrible experiences. Others, like Meidner, found it actually a very positive experience. In fact, it was his most positive experience in Britain, because his work, which was very expressionistic, was not appreciated by the British public at this time. But on the Isle of Man, he was closeted among an intelligentsia who knew his work, knew his reputation, spoke his language, and he felt comfortable at home. So we find a very sort of pugnacious, self-assured portrait from this period, in contrast to perhaps the rather sombre but resilient faces that we find in the portraits of Bloch and Bomberg. I can't show you now, but the rest of this sketchbook is also extraordinary. It contains other works that Meidner created in internment, full of colour and full of surprises. Some of the motifs go back to the work he created in the First World War. And so this self-portrait at the beginning is absolutely what we want to show of Meidner in the context of his peers, but doesn't perhaps give us a glimpse of what else it contains. So Herman, having come to this point in London, he's mixing predominantly with these artists, particularly I might say Meidner and Bomberg, who often have very heated discussions on art, and Herman, despite learning English after Meidner, is often acting as a translator between them and often picking a very judicious way to translate the words to keep the peace and to keep the discussion going. During this period, a number of these artists had been exhibited, first of all in an exhibition in 1942 in Glasgow, which Benno Schotz organised with Herman's help. and this was the first exhibition to bring specifically Jewish art as the label that he used to Glasgow during this period. Rather astonishing that he was able to do this in 1942 during wartime. He brought work by Soutine, Modigliani, Chagall, Manet-Katz, as well as Hermann, Schotz, Adler and their contemporaries, Bomberg and so on. So it was natural that Hermann should continue to mix with these figures when he came to London. And many of them were also shown in the Ben Uri itself, which in 1944 moved to premises in Portman Square and opened with a new exhibition. But Hermann did not show in this exhibition, and this may have been because this was the period in which he went to Wales. He went for a weekend. I think he went by chance at the invitation of a friend. He went to the small mining town of Astraganlais. He stood on the bridge at sunset and he saw a group of miners standing there. The sun set behind them. It formed discs over their head that looked like halos. He was a great collector, I should say, also of icons, which David Herman has written about specifically in his essay. And this was a seminal moment for Herman. He said that he found there everything he'd been looking for. Remember, in London, he was not really doing so much work. The work he'd been doing in the Memory of Memories series had come to an end, and he was looking for a new source of inspiration. He found it there in Astraganlais. He went for a weekend. He said, I stayed for 11 years. He created the work that we know very well, these strong, empathetic forms of working people, dignified, a new community in which he found himself to be at home, because perhaps in many ways it was like the community he'd left behind. It was an enclosed community, a working community with its own language, its own customs. He had a great respect for the working people and they for them, because as they trooped past his window in the morning, about 5 o'clock on their way to the mines, his light was already on. He was already up and sketching and working. So there was a strong empathy between him and this community, and this led him on to create the work which brought to fruition all the ideas that had been in his head throughout these years. Through Europe. And I'd like to finish the talk there on that seminal moment.
Thank
I know your interpretation of this final Purim painting talks about Epstein and Hermann's own, their own collective influence. But the figures themselves underneath the mask, to me, are dead. And I can't help wondering whether this is actually a war picture, if you like. Probably one of the only pictures that's really specifically about war. After all, he'd lost his family, he knew he'd lost his family, and all these influences. But the faces are dead, and they look like war masks to me. I mean, is there any mileage in this?
Well, I think there probably is mileage. I think all the pictures that he created in this period, in a sense, are war pictures, because they're created against that backdrop, and with a particular consciousness of what is happening to European Jewry. The exhibition that Schotz put on in Scotland, he wrote about as specifically being a sort of flag of Jewish culture at this time, that it was important to show what had been achieved and what lay in the future. And I think throughout the Purim series, Herman was doing the equivalent in paint. So I think that's an equally valid interpretation. And you know, the detailing, I think, is really, it's open to anyone's suggestion. But for me, these masks are very different to the masks we see in the other works, such as the ones upstairs and at the beginning here. And to me, they seem very much like the work you would have seen in perhaps Epstein's ethnographic collection.
Did he have any patrons here in London or in Britain, generally speaking? I mean, how did he support himself? that was a pretty prestigious exhibition he had.
It was,
And I'm
yes.
just wondering if someone was pulling strings for him, and you know, did he have someone who sort of took him under their wing? And
Sure. Well, certainly in Glasgow, that person was Benno Schatz,
Right.
and then the Jewish businessman that I spoke about, that was extremely important at the beginning. And then he very quickly found his feet in doing work with the New Art Club and the New Art Centre. However, how lucrative that was, I don't know. I think he would have been penniless when he arrived. So you're right, it was very prestigious for him to get a show with the Lefebvre Gallery. As far as I know, David, we don't have a terrible amount of detailed information about how that came about.
From the 40s, no. I mean, certainly in the 50s and 60s, for example, there was a story that the writer J.B. Priestley walked into a London show and bought the entire show before it even opened, which would have been a good break for an artist at the height of his time. And several people in the 60s were regular collectors of his work, and various foundations, the Skye Peter Stuyvesant Foundation in South Africa, would regularly buy a lot of his work. Aggie, do you have any?
But it was at the Lefebvre Gallery that Gustav del Banco discovered Herman. He just started the gallery in Cork Street at the time, and he bought two early works which he showed me in his house, and they exhibited his work regularly thereafter, already in the 40s.
Yes.
And they sold extremely well.
And they, in fact,
And
were
so he did
very
have a-
supportive of émigré artists in particular,
Yeah,
weren't
he did.
they?
Well,
So,
being immigrants
yes.
themselves, they understood the
absolutely.
problem.
And anyone who doesn't know, this is Aggie Katz, who was a former Ben Uri curator and in fact put on the first exhibition of Herman's Memory of Memory drawings in 1984, which then travelled to Glasgow in 85.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. No,
But-
I mean, he started his tribal art collection at the encouragement of Jacob Epstein, who had it, and he sort of said that if you ever sell any artwork, if you decide to devote half of what you receive to a tribal piece, then you are well on the way, and that's exactly what he did.
What he did.
And he must have sold a lot because he had a very good collection.
It was a wonderful collection,
Yeah,
wasn't
so-
it? Yes.
And he was used to a very modest way of life. He came from a very poor background.
Yes.
So he didn't,
He wasn't, no, he didn't live in luxury, certainly.
So he
David
was.
shared with us the wonderful story of how Herman believed you should always have a bed in every room, so that there was always room for someone who might just turn up needing a place to stay, and that it took your mother many years to persuade him not to have a bed, in fact, in every room. But
Many years.
he
She
always
lost.
kept
She won the
one in
battle on the
studio.
living room, but lost the battle on the studio, where he kept a bed all the way through till
He
done.
remained his own domain. Yes. But I think, yeah, so partly he did have some supporters. He did have an astonishing amount of exhibitions in those early years. Even in Brussels, even though he was only there 18 months, he had 2 exhibitions, one in Namur, the other was it in Bruges, I think. So everywhere he went, he did manage to find supporters, mount exhibitions, and presumably he sold work that way, though obviously not, realising a huge income, but perhaps with his modest
Enough to,
requirements enough to keep him
survive,
painting, which after all was his raison d'etre, I think.
And Sarah, you think this one is from 45?
This is 45, yes. I don't know what you make of it, David. To me, I find it quite dark and menacing. It's a very dark palette. Again, the masks are very dominant. David Glass's point about the dead faces behind these masks, that seems to me very pertinent to this one as well. To me as well, the date of that perhaps is his summing up of this subject at the end of the war.
I've seen a few other ones, all the Purim players, which he did 44, 43, in past, and they're very much in that, in that palette.
Yes.
Which
Yes.
I always call stained glass colour.
Right.
Because of
Yes.
the blue that red.
So no others like this,
No, I
this
haven't
one?
seen
No.
any others like that, I must say.
And I mean, there's lots of sort of lively sketches around this subject, and this is a selection of them. We did trace more, but due to space we couldn't show them all, but these are very representative of what can be found. So with the paintings, in each of these three paintings, this one is 1940, 43 and 45, the depiction varies quite considerably, and so I thought there would be an interesting juxtaposition to put them together, dealing with the same subject but in quite a different way.
Out of the other artists who he befriended at this stage, Bomberg, Bloch, who would you say he either had the most kinship with?
Certainly with Adler, I would
Yeah.
say. And as we see in the photograph in the information panel at the end, there's a Talita prayer shawl in the back of the picture which Adler gave to him, which he kept in the studio for the rest of his life. And they only had, I think it was 5 years once he was in London, because Adler died in 48, I believe. But that obviously, although I think the link lessened to some extent in London simply because there was a much wider group of painters and fellow Yiddish speakers, I think that link remained between them absolutely for the rest of their lives. And later, of course, he would work with Bloch again in Wales, and it was obviously a very lively relationship, as he describes it, between Meidner and Bomberg, and I think he found that challenging but enormously inspiring. You know, and this was a very difficult period for Bomberg himself in particular. He was very depressed in this period, got very little support from the establishment, and had turned really to himself and his family to paint as subject matter. I think that comes across very much in that depiction. And there is a kind of relationship, I think, between all these self-portraits in the period there. Even though the Bloch one, I should say, is slightly earlier, but they all show a sort of resilience. And I'm still here throughout the vicissitudes of war.
Sarah, when you say the establishment, what exactly do you mean? The British Jewish establishment, or the British establishment of, you know, English Brits, if you follow me? But I get the impression that there was this well-established Jewish community, British Jewish community, an establishment within the Jewish community, and then you had this community of emigres, and they seem to have moved in different worlds. I mean, you know, for example, the Yiddish language itself seems to have separated these emigre artists from maybe even people like your friend Mark Gertler, who, you know, British born. Was he born here?
Yes, he was.
Well,
yeah, well, I mean, I see Mark Gertler, even though he
was born
can,
here by chance.
Yeah.
But he was born.
Yeah, I see him as being part of a sort of establishment of, you know, people who went to the Slade School and had the pedigree of good schools, that went to all the right art schools, and they, by this period, well, of course, yeah.
Yes, he was gone by this period, but I take your point, even though that's a sort of another complex set of histories, I think, which to bring up here, but certainly they were a different group at this time, but, you know, there were conduits into showing at these galleries like the Lefebvre, people like Schatz, you know, acting to introduce them, people like Epstein, who of course himself had had terrible trials with the British establishment, but was becoming perhaps a little more accepted in this period, although not really entirely until much nearer the end of his life. But certainly figures like that would have helped to make contacts between them. But also at places like the Ohel Centre, they did specifically keep alive the Yiddish culture, which united many of them. And I said it was a Polish refugee centre, but in fact it almost immediately embraced emigres and exiles from every nationality, and, you know, Yiddish was a common language. And people like Stenzel and Manga kept alive the Yiddish culture. They wrote and published in Yiddish very strong exponents of the Yiddish culture, so that he was able to both have that side of his life, if you like, and to move sort of outside that when he was going to other places like Astraganlais, or he did later travel widely, but he always kept up those contacts, was later instrumental in setting up the Jewish Quarterly with Jacob Sontag. So I think somehow he was able to keep those two parts of his life, but perhaps to separate them slightly.
But I think it's always very interesting when somebody has two kinds of separate lives, which they insist on keeping separate,
Yes.
but are passionately committed to both, but in very different ways. One other thing which does strike me, again, looking at these portraits, is that all these sort of figures, Bloch, Bomberg, Epstein, Adler, Benno Scholz, they're all about 20 or so years older than Joseph, and it's sort of interesting that all the people who really mattered to him were that little bit older, or quite significant amount older, rather than people either the same age or indeed younger.
That is an interesting point, yes, certainly. And perhaps his own initially difficult relationship with his father, which he was able to reassess more positively later on, had something to do with that, finding...
Were there any younger artists that he had a major influence on?
They've been an influence on?
Yes.
Well, certainly people like the late Mira Hammermesh, Phyllis Lawson, those were his two main students in the 50s. And some people in Wales as well, but not none of them, I think, were as well known as the older figures.
And purely coincidence that Mira and were women?
I don't. Sharp intake of breath around here. I don't know.
And there's also Phyllis Lawson, of course, and Joan Hadley, but there you go.
No, I didn't. I meant to put it on the basis of the fact that all the people, his mentors were men.
Yes, yes.
But the people who he had influence on were women, and that's how I'm just taking Sarah's point and just taking it another stage, probably too far, but nonetheless.
It's certainly an interesting point.
You may also say something about the number of women artists among that refugee generation. I don't know. There were sadly very few.
Well, there were very few women artists altogether.
Well, yes.
Yes.
So when did your dad settle down and marry, David?
Well, there were two marriages. So the first to Catriona MacLeod, I'm afraid I can't remember when they married. In
42.
42, yes.
Yes, because it was the year of the Edinburgh exhibition, yes, 42.
And then they separated in the mid-50s, early to mid-50s, and then he married, well, he then started living with my mother in the mid-1950s, but they didn't marry till the early 1960s, because he wasn't, for some strange reason, wasn't divorced from Catriona MacLeod until then. It took a long time for the divorce to come through.
Catriona MacLeod being a Scottish lass, I take it?
Yes.
Yeah.
From a very affluent family, but a bit of a rebel is my sense, I don't know. But
yes, seems to have been very unconventional. She was an artist herself. She'd already been married, hadn't she? And brought up, spent a lot of her childhood on the Isle of Skye, hence the little interlude in Skye and the pictures that come out of that.
And I think she might have been disowned, is that right, for marrying Joseph?
There sort of seems to be some conflicting stories about that, but yes, I think the parents weren't very keen.
I see.
And she...
Well, I'm not going to continue that conversation.
Were there any children to that relationship?
No, and I think that was one of the things which sort of contributed to the ending of that relationship, that there was a very sad miscarriage, which was, I think, devastating for both of them in different ways. And I think it was obviously very devastating for her, but I think in other respects it was devastating for him, as a sort of, again, wondering whether he could ever sort of bring people to life, so to speak, if that doesn't sound too crude.
No, doesn't at all.
And I think two of his unhappiest periods correspond with one, a miscarriage from his first marriage, and secondly, the death of a daughter from his second marriage. And I think those were sort of both brought back memories from other losses.
suspect that if I don't throw this to
Yes.
some sort of hall,
We'll keep on.
there
So
will
many
be coffee and
questions.
croissants tomorrow morning about 8 o'clock. So I just on behalf of everybody, can I, actually I must thank you, Aggie, for bringing this to the world's attention 25 years ago, 35 years ago,
Yeah.
25, 27 years ago?
25.
25 plus years ago. Otherwise that folder would have been sitting and you would have found it. So all these years ago. And then to Sarah for bringing together this remarkable exhibition.
Here, here.
Wonderful.
Yeah.